Because there's two people I know you want to meet.
Yes.
But in the meantime, Barry Norman, ladies. And our next guest, very much one of the new breed of Hollywood actresses who are finding themselves in more intelligent roles, most notably, in her case, in films like The Big Chill and Jagged Edge. She's also the co-producer of a documentary to be shown on television on Sunday called You Mean There Are Still Real Cowboys? A film about the remains of the Wild West. But I'd like you to meet now Glenn Close. I suppose being an American star, an American actress, you're familiar with a chat show and all the rest of it.
Yes, I've done my share. I've been on the Johnny Carson show and David Letterman show, and I'd heard about your show.
No.
Well, I'd heard about when the opportunity came to come over and talk about the documentary. I was very intrigued, and I heard that I was going to be on your show and how popular your show is and everything, and I'd never
You've been talking to the right
show.
people. I mean, I'm sure you haven't been talking to him. Probably you've been talking to my mother, haven't you?
The funny thing was, though, I was on a research trip for a movie that I'm developing, and I was in Kinshasa, Zaire, and I turned on television late at night, and there was the Terry Wogan show.
I haven't been paid for that.
You're very big in Zaire, Terry.
Has Michael Gray... Have you been selling my shows to Zaire without telling me, Michael? I was going to ask you first, before we talk about the documentary that you've done, about... you've had 3 Oscar nominations.
Mm-hmm.
But the film that really established you, I mean, The Natural was fine. Then came Jagged Edge. Why do you think that was the one? Was it the best of them?
Oh, I don't think it was necessarily the best. They're also very different. I think Jagged Edge was a very strong story. It was the first time that a courtroom drama had been done in quite a few years. And I think the combination of the story, the acting, it was very good.
Are you going to do
it was a surprise because they hadn't made movies like that for a while. And now they are making more.
Well, of course, yes, with the heroine being the barrister, the lawyer. Yeah. I mean, did you identify with that character? Did you find it
very
easy?
Very much.
Was there a lot of you in it?
Yes, quite a bit in that character, yeah. And I did research with a very impressive young woman lawyer in Chicago, and I learned a tremendous amount. It's a wonderful luxury to play a part and learn about a whole part of life that you wouldn't know about necessarily. And
it was a kind of surprise hit, wasn't it, Barry? Jagged Edge. You liked it, I know.
I liked it immensely. I told Glenn upstairs in hostility, we're actually quite friendly up there this evening, that it was one of my favourite films of last year. And it really, were you there? It really was one of my favourite films of last year. I thought it was brilliantly done, and she was super, and so was Jeff Bridges.
Yeah.
Is there going to be a Jagged Edge 2?
They're talking about it. They've been talking about it ever since the...
How can they do that?
Well, I don't know. I think one of the wonderful things about the chemistry in that movie was what my character and Robert Loggia had together.
Ah, yes.
I think the contrast was wonderful, and we had a great time. And I think if they could build on that, it would be worthwhile.
Of course, the Jeff Bridges character can't be there, can he?
Not really.
No.
There's not much of a part for Jeff in that one.
Yeah.
But I think a sequel really has to be almost better than the original, or else it's not worth doing.
But sequels have tended to happen. I mean, it's become a kind of Hollywood tradition, not just with Rambo, but with...
well, there's Friday the 13th, Part 6 out already, I think. Or is it Friday the 6th, Part 13? It's something like that.
What about your documentary about cowboys, and why? Tell us a bit about it.
Well, it's something that is very, very close to my heart. My parents have lived out in a tiny town in the Green River Valley, which is in a very rugged part of Wyoming, since 1976. My father's a doctor in a little clinic there. And I went with him on house calls one day, and I'd gotten to know a lot of the people in the town. And it was on that day that I met some of the old people in the area. And their wonderful faces, their wonderful way of talking, their simplicity, their straightforwardness, I found very, very moving. And I realized that when they go, with them will go the real West. their memories, the life that they've led. And I'd seen Reds, and you remember those wonderful interviews in Reds?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And,
the witnesses.
Yeah,
yes.
the witnesses. It was magnificent because you saw these faces and these people talked, and I could have listened to them all night. So my initial idea was to just document these people before they were gone. And then I thought it should be, with that, you should have some idea of the life that they lead now, the cowboys there, because it's very, very hard, much harder than I think anybody ever realizes. And I met by chance, I think it was a couple of years later, on the QE2, coming back from England, John Blair, who was lecturing and showing 2 of his documentaries. Or one was a documentary called Schindler, and the other one was the Biko Inquest. And I was very impressed with John. He had answered questions afterwards. And I went up and I introduced myself, and we had dinner, and I told him about this idea. And he ran with it. He came to the BBC. Who co-produced with his company. I put in some money of my own and brought in some American money. And on Sunday, you'll see the result.
You brought in Robert Redford to do the commentary, which is a bit of a coup.
Yes, yes.
How come you get, I mean, it's not going to be, we'd all like to get Robert Redford for a documentary, but he's just doing the narrative.
The narration, yeah. I had gotten to know him when we did The Natural. And I know that one of the great loves and passions of his life is the West. And I met him, funnily enough, going out to Salt Lake City to meet John to do the final segment of this movie. And I said, we're making this documentary. We met on the airplane. And could I show it to you when we're finished? And he said, sure, that he'd be very interested. And so I think this past February or March, we went and showed it to him, very, very nervous, a rough cut in his office in New York. And at the end, he turned to us, and he was very, very moved by it. He said, what can I do? And I took a deep breath and said, would you narrate? And he said, I will.
Great.
And
you love it because you love Westerns, weren't you?
Oh, yeah, sucker for Westerns.
But that was the Wild West.
That was the
which
Wild
didn't
West,
really
yeah.
exist. This is the
Oh,
real
sure it
West.
did.
Some of it existed.
But only
Absolutely,
for about 40 minutes.
No, more than 40 minutes.
40 years.
In Big
40
Piney,
50
even.
years.
Oh, in Big Piney, in the turn of the century, they were still having wars with sheep herders and cattlemen. And it was
The great thing about the Wild West was that somebody like Bat Masterson, who was Wyatt Earp's deputy, ended up as sports editor of the New York Post. It's just incredible, isn't it? And Wyatt Earp, in the 20s, used to hang around the set of John Ford's silent westerns, and Ford hated him because he was always getting drunk with the extras and the people reeling on and off the set. So this was the great Wyatt Earp was doing all this.
Extraordinary.
It's still a very, very hard part of the country. I mean, the people are fantastic, but the climate is very brutal. The life is very hard. They play hard and they work hard.
Glenn, thank you for telling us about that. I hope you'll stay because we've somebody I know that you want to meet, and you too, Barry. So thank you in the meantime. Glenn Close. The final guest on this kind of mini Cannes Film Festival is one of that band of resolutely British filmmakers who've made it big in Hollywood in recent years. And he kept all his money too. I'm going to ask him about that. In his case, with films like The Emerald Forest and Excalibur, but his latest effort brought him back home to his childhood in a London suburb during the war. It's called Hope and Glory. Here's the young Boorman making the best of the Blitz. And you thought hooliganism started in the 1980s? Welcome, John Boorman. Well, that was what it was like, was it? I mean, kind of youthful hooliganism, high spirits.
I'm glad you're bringing violence back into television after...
Quite. That's me out of a job. Thank you. Thank you for drawing the attention of everybody to that. Thank you, John.
Yes, that was my childhood, looting and pillaging.
Well, I mean, if you hadn't done it, Hitler would.
Well, he had. He started...
Yes, I suppose he was. Yeah.
I think that, of course, I was much more terrified of school than I was of the war.
I was just going to ask you, it was a good time. I mean,
Well,
you
it
write
was,
about it
yes.
affectionately.
It was. I mean, I think that this was something I haven't really seen. That's why I wanted to make the film. Really, was that as children during that time, we had the most wonderful time. I mean, the fireworks displays, every night with the bombings and the Battle of Britain, and of course, the bomb sites are a perfect playground for children who are natural anarchists. You go out there and smash things up like we just saw. And of course, the men were away. You see, the fathers were mostly away at war, so there was very little supervision. The women were mostly either working or having love affairs with foreign soldiers. So we children were allowed to run amok. And
It's a foul slur on the women of England left behind. I'm saying.
Unfortunately true.
Was it? Yeah. Will this be fully covered in the film?
somewhat, yes, because...
Are any of your family talking to you?
Well, no, they're not, no. It does, particularly my sister, my older sister, Wendy, who's the model for the teenage girl in the film who gets pregnant, and she was, when I showed her the script, she collapsed and took to her bed for 3 days in a state of shock, because she was astonished that this 7-year-old boy had observed these goings-on, these nocturnal goings-on that she thought she got away with, and not only observed them, remembered them, worse still, written them down, and was proposing to make film of them. You see. But after her nervous breakdown, she decided that she wouldn't object because she felt that, you know, at least it was some kind of immortality that I was offering her.
Yeah. And you created all those semi-detached in the middle of Wisley, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The middle of a field in Wisley. Semi-detached houses stretching out, which is supposed to be Carshalton, where you'd
yes.
grown up.
Yes.
And it's a remarkable thing you've created with the barrage balloons and all that kind of thing. I can hardly wait to see it, I'm sure it'll be. Have you seen it, Barry?
Yes, I have, yeah. It is very good, yeah. Yeah, you must all run and see it. It really is excellent. Because
I dare you to say anything else. It's all very well.
Exactly. What else am I going to say? No, and also, you see, I can remember the war. No, you say, no, you can't possibly. Indeed, I can. And we were bombed out. I was staying with my grandparents at Edgware, and the bomb dropped in our back garden on the Anderson shelter. Was it the Anderson shelter, the outside one?
Yes.
Which I was supposed to be in at the time.
The Morrison was indoors.
That's right, the Morrison was indoors. And it was the most amazing thing, my grandfather was standing in the hall and he was hurled against the front door. And when the house stopped shaking and he drew back from the front door, in the glass panel there was a little piece cut out exactly in the shape of his nose. And the rest of it was there, he was totally unhurt, and there was just this nose-shaped hole in the door.
I suppose it's...
The Ferrari's waiting outside.
Oh, bless you.
It's a kind of...
Ferraris, John. One's not enough.
Yeah, quite. This man has his price and he hasn't said what it is yet. But it's also a social comment, really, on the way the war changed people's lives. Because certainly from the book, it seems to me you're implying that if the war hadn't happened, the entire lower middle class of this country would have turned catatonic almost, unable to communicate or emote or do anything.
Remained catatonic, yes. You know, because it was interesting, you know, I'm a kind of closet, semi-detached dweller, you see, who... there were 4 million of these houses built between the wars, and it created this new class, a sort of the lower middle class, really, because the people who occupied them were drawn from, either from, they were being sucked out of the slums, or they were clawing their way up the social ladder, or they were, because of the depression, they were slipping down from the middle class, and there they were gathered. Nobody knew where they came from, or how to behave, or how to speak, or what to do, and we all had this kind of air of foolishness about us. And so everyone kept to themselves. They were very nervous about their social status. And we were isolated. It was a kind of class limbo that we were living in. And it took the war, of course, to give sort of common cause so that everyone could leap over their inhibitions. And you know, of course, I spent my early part of my life desperately ashamed that I wasn't higher born, you know. And then when the working class came into fashion in the 60s, I was desperately ashamed that I couldn't claim to be lower born, you know. and since I've made this film, I'm constantly meeting closet semis, people who leap out and say to me, I was lived in one of those places. And they're now becoming quite respectable, you know, architecturally, whereas they were reviled for years, you know, by architects, because they had nothing to do with them. They were built by spec builders. They were fantasies, really, those houses, with the sunsets and the stained glass.
Little stained glass bits,
and they were just fantasies of a kind of rural Britain. And it was a bit of, you know, Anne Hathaway's cottage and a little bit of, you know, Robin Hood and a ship sailing away. And now, of course, the architects are saying, after all the dreadful things we've been through, all the tower blocks, they're saying, well, maybe they were the best thing that were built in England since in the last 100 years.
I suppose you're right. Because certainly the tower blocks are no example to anybody.
They're all falling down, and those semis are still standing, and people are very happily living in them.
Yeah. I was going to ask Glenn that, Glenn, you're not as conscious, obviously, or at least we fondly imagine, in America, of class. And you're too young to remember the war.
I know what he's talking about, because I did a play called Benefactors in New York. And it is about just that. It's about an architect who builds a tower block, and it becomes this terrible albatross around his neck, and what they think what he ends up... anyway, it's all about that kind of thing.
Well, actually, people are happier living in that kind of house, I think. A little back garden.
Than in a tower block.
Yes. Much more.
You were talking also in the book, as you did with Emerald Forest, about how much it cost and the problems of raising money. And you must have been brought up on that with your father trying to raise money for things.
Yeah, except he was lucky in that he was there in the last days of the studio system in England, so that he was working at Ealing, and if he got a project he wanted to make, he just took it along to Sir Michael Boorman and said, I'd like to film this. And Boorman would say, okay, you've got so many weeks to do it in and so much money to do it in. And he didn't have to worry too much about raising the money. I would hate to be in the kind of position that John and the others are in.
I was going to ask you too about your book, because you cast a certain amount of aspersions on directors, saying that there's too much fuss made of directors now about, people talk about John Ford's Stagecoach, as if John Ford had starred in the thing, lit it, did the makeup, painted the sets and all the rest of it. So you don't, directors, a bit too much of a fuss really made.
It's a useful shorthand to say John Boorman's Hope and Glory. But William Goldman, the scriptwriter, a man I greatly admire, he points out the nonsense of saying Steven Spielberg's The Colour Purple, because what he says is if there were 6 colour purples, then Steven Spielberg's The Colour Purple would actually make more sense. But it is a sort of shorthand way of identifying a film for the reader or indeed the viewer.
Well, I'll ask you, Glenn, do you think that directors are the people who make the movie?
Or do you want Glenn Close's Jagged Edge?
No. The thing the thing about movies that I adore is the collaborative effort that they represent. I think a director is like a general of an army. He has to have a very strong vision and concept in order to make that happen. But also, if you have a good producer, they have a tremendous amount to say, and sometimes the producers are there long before a director is hired.
Well, in John's case as a director, of course, he usually has his whole family in it. And it's about his family this time, which is the ultimate in nepotism. So you get very little arguments, I think. Do you find that that's useful?
Actually, they're the only people who do argue with me, because one of the problems, if you're in charge, you're this tyrant running this set, is that people often tend to tell you what they think you want to hear. You know, like your people do here, I've noticed.
Certainly. And indeed Barry told you, yeah.
But my kids always are prepared to tell me the truth, and in the most painful way possible.
Yeah. I hate that about children.
Yes.
But he's not very kind to them, Terry, because his son Charlie was the star of the Emerald Forest. In Hope and Glory, all the poor lad has to do is drop in on a parachute as a German who bailed out of an aeroplane. He doesn't even have a line to say. Well, that's the kind of thing that brings nepotism into ill repute.
It is, yes, it is. But we wish you luck. We wish you luck with Hope and Glory anyway. Success. Thank you, man. Thank you, Barry. Thank you.